Here we go, back again. I took a quick coffee break, and now I'm back at my post, which means sitting at my desk, staring at my computer, talking into it, which is what I do for a living now, several hours a day. So we're almost at the end of German unification, but I wanted to include this quote before we move on. The British Prime Minister, off and on, in the latter half of the 19th century, Benjamin Disraeli, one of the greats in British political history, said about the unification of Germany, this war represents the German Revolution, the Franco-Prussian War, a greater political event than the French Revolution of the last century. Not a single principle in the management of our foreign affairs accepted by all statesmen for guidance up to 6 months ago any longer exists. There is not a diplomatic tradition which has not been swept away. The balance of power has been entirely destroyed. And the country which suffers most and feels the effects of this great change most is England. Basically, I mean, it's a dramatic and eloquent statement by an extremely eloquent statesman, but all the European countries were sort of reacting and thinking this way, just not many could say it as well as Benjamin Disraeli. So now we get to the second half of our unit, late 19th century European imperialism. And here the British or English octopus spreading its tentacles around the globe in a rather funny looking cartoon. By the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, Great Britain had the biggest empire in the world, but all the European countries had colonial possessions, or many of them. They're including the U.S. In this as well, if you look at the bottom right. But the British Empire was the supreme empire. It was said that the sun never sets on the British Empire, which was literally true. Anywhere the sun was out, the British had a colony somewhere, in that part of the world. But the French have a fantastically large empire as well. If you look at French West Africa on the map, you'll see it there. So it's mostly the British Empire during this period that we hear about, but the Germans eventually have one. The Danish, the Italians, the Portuguese, the Spanish, we know about a little bit already. Mainly the Spanish Empire are remnants from its 16th century conquests. Nonetheless, Europe was able to impose its will on the rest of the globe by force or threat of force, and we're going to look into sort of how and why. First, the balance sheet of empire, costs and benefits, both in Europe and abroad. It's quite easy, and I mean, because there's a lot of truth to it, to conclude that empire, helped the European countries and did nothing but harm to those countries that they either conquered or controlled in one way or another. And I'm not saying that's not true, or you can't make a strong argument, or the only argument there. The great leftist revolutionary from the middle of the 20th century, Frantz Fanon, said, imperialism leaves behind germs of rot which we must clinically detect and remove not only from our land, but from our minds as well. He thought colonialism, imperialism left nothing but negative consequences for the colonized, and actually negative consequences for the colonizers themselves, which we'll kind of get into. A current present-day historian, a Brit, the Scottish Neil Ferguson, I thought it was Niall, but he pronounces it Neil, at least maybe since he moved to the United States. He's a professor at Harvard now, history professor. But he says in a book on this very subject, prima facie, there seems to be a plausible case that empire, in other words, was a good thing. So he, in a book on the British Empire, he wrote one on an American Empire as well, which is interesting. He says that the British, when they brought, as they did, law, concepts, legal and otherwise, of liberty, representative government, capitalism, that those ended up being highly beneficial for one after another European countries. But it does sound incredibly arrogant and self-serving. And certainly it can be seen that way, and maybe is that way, for a current British history professor to talk about how the British Empire benefited the peoples that it conquered by bloody, brutal force. And so I think there's no way around taking quite seriously the claim that that's indeed what happened. That there's really nothing that the Europeans can say, without just grossly distorting the truth, except that we came in and bludgeoned you, and by sort of the might makes right philosophy only, forced you to succumb to our will. However, I do think a case can be made, and I am going to make it anyway, since I try to play devil's advocate and try to get us to see multiple sides of things. So I read Ferguson's book. I wasn't convinced by all of it. Maybe certain things, not others. But there is some interesting, I think, points to be made here. And first of all, it's that the British did leave behind those things. Some would say, well, capitalism doesn't do us any good. It's just harmful. Maybe. That's certainly a possibility. But British law, British concept of liberty, representative government, it did stick in many places. You can sort of look this up for yourself, and it could be just a coincidence, but places in what was used to be called the Third World during the Cold War, the poorer countries of the world, in those parts of the world today, former colonies of Great Britain, in most cases, not all, but overwhelmingly so, tend to sort of have better functioning governments and more democratic systems today than their neighbors who weren't under the thumb of Britain's imperial or colonial control, maybe under the thumb of other European countries. So it's possible that British imperialism actually can be defended a little bit more than other European countries. However, again, I come back to, in the end, Franz Fanon's argument, which was extreme on one side. It is hard to make the case in the end. To tell the people of the world, you're better off for us having conquered you. The Romans tried to say that. All conquerors try to say that. So it's a tough argument to make, partly because there's just going to be pushback no matter what, understandably. But it's also a tough argument, I think, that to argue it, convincingly. So. But one other comment before I go on here, and that is, even if, and I'm saying I think the likelihood is that Fanon is closer to right than Ferguson, even if that's true, since so many scholars today, particularly in our country, will cite problems in the poorer countries of the world and try to understand their history and sort of their causes, and will still to this day cite European imperialism and colonialism as one of the major contributing factors to poverty in other problems in such countries. And I wouldn't argue that that's not a cause. It is, but it's, I think, one of many. And I do have a question that I don't have an answer to, and that is, how long is that going to be? Is it going to be legitimate to say that? So 100 years from now, will it still be true that any problems other countries have that were once colonized by the Europeans are due to European colonialism, imperialism? 1,000 years from now, if they're still having problems, will it still be legitimate cause to say, well, it's just because of the British and the French that were here 1,500 years ago. That's why we're still having these issues. So there has to be, I think, in my opinion, I think there needs to be kind of a healthy debate about how much we can still, and going forward in the future, we'll be able to still sort of use the Europeans as sort of the explanation for what went wrong. And again, it's possible that will still be true 1,500 years from now. But if it's actually not true now or at some point, then what that means is that anyone who believes it's true and is trying to solve problems in the world is already on the wrong track because they have the wrong causes. So it is I think it's a highly charged issue, but it's an important one to get at. So balance sheet, I would say Ferguson is on somewhat shaky ground there, if not more so. But I agreed with some of the things that I read in his book. Formal and informal empire. it used to be that it was just called empire because there was only one kind, at least that was recognized as such. So there wasn't a term formal and informal because there weren't two different kinds. But the type of empire that was the original, the one and only for a time, is what we now call formal empire, because eventually another type was discovered or labeled, and so informal empire and formal then have been sort of side by side ever since. As far back as around the turn of the 20th century, Lord Lugard, you see here, a high-ranking British official dealing with colonial policy, imperialist policy, already had sort of himself scoped out this idea that there are two types of empire, formal and informal. It didn't catch on in the scholarly community until around the 1960s. So Lugard was way ahead of his time. A couple of British historians in the 1960s started writing books, and ever since it's caught on, historians now take it for granted there are two types, formal and informal empire. So what are they? Formal empire is, again, the more traditional one, the one we think of as empire even now. We get what we want by making you our colony. We come in with military forces, we conquer you, we send in governors, we send in civil servants, bureaucrats to govern you, hands-on police. We directly control by living there, even if we're a minority of your population. We are in the dominant positions of power and control the important institutions, control the communications and the railroads and this and that. We impose our way of life, our legal system, our currency. It's not always all those things, but it's this hands-on, day-to-day, formal control. We've annexed this other country as our colony, formal, hands-on. The informal type of empire is the one that wasn't noticed for a long time, except by Lugard and maybe a few others. This is what we want by not making you our colony. So the informal type is usually economic control, primarily. You can leverage if you're the stronger, more powerful country. And let's call a time out here. I guess we should sort of get some of our other terminology out of the way. Imperialism, what does it even mean? I have a very broad, simple working definition that we could get, we could pick apart and say it's not complex enough. But it I think works for pedagogical purposes, so I'm going to use it here. And that is that when one larger and more powerful country or empire is able to control the politics, economics, land, labor, resources, etc., institutions of a smaller, less powerful country. Whether it's done formally or informally, it still fits that. Both of those fit that overall broad definition. So in the informal way of controlling their politics and economy, you sort of lean on them by threats. Much of them are economic. If you've loaned them money, for instance, them being that country, that government, you can say, hey, we're going to turn the spigots of money off if you don't if you don't do what we want. And so then there are advantages to informal empire. Number one, it's cheaper, so that you don't have to go through the expense of sending troops, sending a governor, sending hundreds or thousands of civil servants, and paying them every month. You let the people, indigenous people in that country, have their own government. They rule themselves, at least so it seems. They have their own king or president, and they have their own civil servants. They have their own flag, their own legal system, and so you're there with sort of a lighter hand, and it's less expensive. It's also more quiet that way. If it's informal control and you don't need troops and police forces, and there's not a white governor in a country or a kingdom in Africa or Asia or somewhere else, then it's not as clear both to the people in that land, that culture, and that country, kingdom, or to the people in the home country, the British people, the French people, the Italian people. right? They might not even know in some cases. I mean, some may know, but it might be a small percentage of the population that actually knows, hey, we actually have informal control over country X. Why is it not very well known when it's informal? Because you only need like one guy on the ground, maybe one, ambassador or agent, as they were sometimes called, maybe with a staff, around him. But he's kind of quietly ensconced in the capital of country X or kingdom X. And when the British government needs something or demands something from the smaller, less powerful country, they send their agent to meet with the king or the president. And he's, of course, going to get in because everyone knows who he is. He's the representative of Great Britain or France. So he gets in to see the king, the president, and it's probably all very polite and nice. The guy knows the manners and the customs of that part of the world. He might even speak the language. And they've probably met before, so they're on speaking terms and know each other a little bit. They might even like each other. So they sit down, and there's tea served, and they're talking pleasantly and sort of like gentlemen. And let's say it's a British guy says, Her Majesty's government, Queen Victoria at this time, Her Majesty's government would like it if you opened more of your ports to our corporate exports. And it can be said that nicely and that informally, pardon the pun, because everybody knows that there's an underlying threat. The king or president already knows that if he doesn't go along and says no, that things could get rougher and tougher. And the ambassador or agent knows that as well. He doesn't have to say things in menacing terms. He doesn't have to intimidate the guy, openly or even through an implied statement. Everybody already knows what's at stake here. He's delivering not a request. He's delivering a demand. And through what we've just said, you can see how there are exceptions, but most of the time, if there's going to be a move from formal to informal or the other way around, it's informal coming first and formal coming second, right? Because we said it's cheaper and it's quieter. Quieter, by the way, is important because then you have less complaint. You have less chance of people in the home country, in your country, rising up saying, we shouldn't be doing that. It's wrong. It's immoral. We're protesting our own government being involved in those kind of unseemly deeds, which happens in the British Empire and others. So if you can keep it quiet through informal empire, you don't have as much chance of getting an opposition movement home. And you don't have as much chance of having riots and rebellion or revolution in the country you're dominating and controlling if it's informal, because your presence there is quiet. It's like one guy. So hardly anyone even knows. It kind of goes unseen. But if the king or the president, let's say he's cooperated for years, finally decides on this issue, I can't or don't want to, the people have been increasingly angry every time I give in to one of your demands, and if I'm afraid if I do it this time, there'll be a revolution and I'll get killed, or at least ousted from power. So I can't. I have to say no, and I'm saying no. Well, in that case, what might happen is that the British will then send out troops and turn informal empire into formal imperialism, and now take hands-on control, if in fact they win. But during the late 19th, early 20th century, and even before, they usually won. So these are the differences between formal and informal empire. Britain, during this period, did both, and again, sometimes moved from one to the other. At the height of British power in its world global empire, it's commonly thrown out now, it's an estimate, so I don't know how accurate it is, that Britain, either formally or informally, ruled over about 25% of the world's population. 25%. If that's even close to accurate, it's astonishing. So the British certainly had an outsized influence on the world, whether welcome or not. We're going to look at two regional models of imperialism, by Europeans as they spread their power and around the globe, especially during this period. Remember, we've already done a unit earlier on about the state of empire, European empire in the 18th century. So empire is nothing new for the Europeans. It's just that they're going much further afield now, and they're filling up more of the globe than before with their own power and influence, again, by force and coercion. So the first model is what they did in Africa, which is swallow it all up in what's known as the scramble for Africa between about 1870 and the outbreak of World War I around 1914. So in those roughly 40 years, basically all of Africa was taken, and most of it was sort of done under formal auspices. These are mostly formal colonies. There are only two parts of Africa that didn't succumb to European rule, and that's it. So the rest of them were swallowed up, as you can see on the map, if you can, on the left there. France, a huge empire in northwest Africa. Great Britain with a number of big colonies and different splotches there. Germany eventually getting on the act as well. But this model was different than the one that follows, because in Africa, which came first, the one in East Asia and China came a little bit later, and they kind of, I think, changed models and directions because of what happened in Africa, and saying, I think we should do it differently this time. But as a country like Britain or France annexed territory in Africa and said, this is our colony, they basically excluded the other European powers from doing trade there and said, no, your corporations are staying out. This is our territory, and we're going to sell our products from our corporations to the here in this part of the world. That's one of the benefits to having colonies. We can do business with them exclusively. So these were very then exclusive colonies and sort of kept kind of capitalist global competition at bay. Around the end of the 19th and 20th century, a new idea came along, which came from the U.S. The Secretary of State at the time, John Hay, famous guy, was originally, as a young man, advisor to Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, now Secretary of State of the U.S., but it's he that conceived the open door policy for China and other parts of Asia as well. By that point, the European powers were in the process of, and had been for quite some time, carving up China and turning it into imperial, imperialist territory as well. But the difference here is that they're trying for free trade now. There are still spheres of influence, as it says here, where, and you can see in the map on the right, different, barely, European countries have a sphere of influence, meaning they're supposed to have more control than the other European countries in that part of China or that part of Asia. But they're deliberately trying not to totally exclude the other countries. The open door model was trying to say, look, unlike Africa, where we all shut each other out, why don't we just each sort of go in and we can, one can dominate one part of Asia or China, and the other can dominate another part, but let's all compete with each other. And your corporations will come into our sphere of influence in China and vice versa, and we'll have healthy competition with each other in a capitalist sense. Of course, in both of these models, they didn't ask the Africans or people in Asia at all what their thoughts or wishes were. That was irrelevant to the Europeans entirely. In fact, the map of Africa today is more or less still based on boundaries and borders the Europeans drew during this period, without any consideration for African realities, cultural, religious, economic, ethnic, etc. So even today, in that sense, I would say European colonialism and imperialism does still have an impact in a big way in Africa. And I'm not denying it doesn't in other ways too. I just wouldn't lean on it as heavily as a cause of problems as maybe some others would. And going forward, as I said, maybe decreasingly. But I think there's no denying that European influence, imperialist influence in Africa certainly has been one of the explanations for all the hardships that Africa has had ever since. As far as justifications for empire are concerned, and we'll talk about the actual motives for empire in a bit, and they overlap, of course, to some degree, but justifications means not necessarily the real causes or the real reasons. It's the Europeans, right? Rationalization. A justification is a rationalization. It's kind of their excuse, or making it sound nice, making it sound good, even if the real motives are something much, more sinister, or at least, sort of much less respectable. We'll get sort of at least a sense of this. Cecil Rhodes, the great diamond magnate who made a fortune in diamonds in South Africa. His company, De Beers, still dominates the diamond market globally today. It's a colossal monopoly, a global monopoly, and it was he that started that company. But the diamonds came from South Africa. We'll get back to that point a little bit later on. The question is, how did Cecil Rhodes, an Englishman, end up legally, in quotation marks, control diamonds, huge amounts of diamonds in South Africa? How did he get the access and rights to them? Early in his career, in an essay that he wrote, it does show signs of sort of youth in the essay, though he probably thought this, at least to some degree, later in life as well. He said about the British, his people, "We are the finest race in the world." He sponsored a project that never got done, of a Cape to Cairo railroad. The Cape of Africa is the southern tip of Africa in South Africa. Cairo, of course, is in Egypt. So the railroad was going to go all the way from the southern tip to basically the north of Africa, which is a long way to go. Africa is a gigantic continent. But this shows his and the British kind of ambition and confidence, maybe overconfidence, and certainly racism and feelings of superiority, a belief in Anglo-Saxon, British, or European, more largely, superiority. However, when Cecil Rhodes, in that same essay, says basically that the world would be better off if the British governed everywhere, governed the whole world. And he does actually say that, but if you read this in context, it's clear he's not saying, not that it makes that much of a difference, but he's not saying that the British should go in and conquer everybody by bloody force and dominate the world through some sort of dictatorship. He sees it as sort of nice. Look, we do everything better than everyone else, he's saying, which is, again, arrogant, racist. I would admit that's true, but he's saying, look, we govern, we know how to govern better, we have a better legal system, we understand rights and freedom and equality better, so just let us come in and we'll dictate, and you'll all be better off. The world will be a happier place, or at least it would be a happier place if the British ruled the whole thing. Now, he didn't necessarily think it was realistic that that was going to happen anytime soon, but it does give us, I think, just looking at Rhodes himself, gives us kind of a window into typical European attitudes, as arrogant and absurd as they sound to us today. Another justification was the three C's: civilization, Christianity, and commerce. And I changed the third one usually to capitalism. Civilization, Christianity, capitalism. It was commerce under capitalist auspices, so that's it. Joseph Chamberlain, another one of the great politicians in Britain of the age, colonial secretary for some time, talked about this in a famous speech, actually a number of speeches, but saying that, well, yeah, of course we're justified in going around the world and establishing imperial control and power because we bring them the three C's: civilization, Christianity, and capitalism. And so it's like, well, okay, but they already have their own religions. Why would they want Christianity? Well, some people have converted in other parts of the world. But it is, of course, presumptuous of Europeans to assume that, of course, they're going to want Christianity. And the same with capitalism. Well, of course, they're going to want that. Of course, it's good for them. Who wouldn't want us to bring capitalism to them? So a certain out of touch, way of thinking here, because people tend not to like it when you bring them things by force and force it down their throats. Even if you bring something that they would, you and they, would both agree is good, they still don't like it if you force them. I know I don't like it if somebody forces me to do something or tries to. So this is somewhat out of touch on Joseph Chamberlain and others' parts. To say that we're bringing them civilization is even worse, of course, because it's implying, for sure, that we're civilized, the Europeans, and everybody else doesn't have it. And so that's why that's why I'm saying one of the benefits, one of the justifications of all this is we bring civilization to them. We help raise up this sort of backward, barbaric group of people, which the Europeans apparently thought everybody but Europeans were. We'll see that in Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden. Another justification for empire is really overlaps with an actual cause of empire, or an actual motive for empire, social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is sort of a harsh philosophy. I'm not sure anybody even identified as an actual social Darwinist. It seems to be kind of a term that's been applied sort of backwards, anachronistically. But it has, I think, some explanatory value about a certain type of views in Europe and America at the time. So social Darwinism basically says that, like Darwinian theory, which we'll get to in a later unit upcoming, just like in the animal kingdom, Darwin's survival of the fittest world, it's a brutal struggle to survive, and there's nothing you can really do about it. They're kind of sort of, social Darwinists are kind of saying they're applying that to human interactions and human relations between individuals in like marketplaces and between countries in international affairs, and saying just like it's natural for the lion on the savannah in Africa to chase down the gazelle, right? It's natural. There's nothing you can do about it. So just accept it. It's the way of the world. It's the way of nature. And we might not like to watch the National Geographic special that shows the lion, chasing down the poor gazelle that it singles out. And oh my God, I don't want to see that. But we don't get mad at the lion because it would be ridiculous. We know that the cat is genetically programmed to do nothing but that to survive. You're not going to be able to go ask nicely, say, Mr. Tiger, could you, or not a lion, could you please stop that? It's violent and dangerous, and become a vegetarian, would you? That can't be done. So it's a clever argument because it's sort of saying just like we can't stop a lion from chasing down a gazelle and eating it, we can't stop Josiah Wedgwood from outdoing his competition and driving other manufacturers and capitalists into bankruptcy. We can't stop John D. Rockefeller from doing the same in the U.S. And so we can't stop the more powerful countries of the world from sort of taking control of and taking resources from other peoples and countries of the world. It's just the way it is. It's just sort of the law of nature. It's survival of the fittest. So they actually use that as both a justification, as unseemly as it is, to put it mildly, but it's actually also an explanation for what they are doing. So Cecil Rhodes and the Cape to Cairo idea as emblematic of European imperial ambitions. As Professor Arnston says, no person managed more successfully than Rhodes to combine the down-to-earth practicality and the starry-eyed idealism that constituted the late 19th century imperialistic spirit. He once wrote that it was his life's work, quote, for the furtherance of the British Empire, for the bringing of the whole civilized world under British rule, for the making of the Anglo-Saxon race into an empire. So what I was alluding to before, he does say it openly and none too subtly, but he didn't mean like a totalitarian dictatorship. but it does show, again, all of those unpleasant qualities and worse that were typical of 19th century Europeans at the time. I love the cartoon. He's bestriding the continent of Africa, arms stretched out with mega confidence. And that was the route that the railroad was planned to have taken. Joseph Chamberlain I already mentioned as well. I'm not going to read this speech, but you can and mine it and sort of see for yourself the type of rhetoric and language used by this very pro-imperialist Brit. We'll see there were some British politicians and members of the population that over time weren't so wild about the British own empire, but Chamberlain was on the other side of that argument, and you can see it in this speech. And he makes some of the same justifications we've already talked about, the 3 C's included. The White Man's Burden, a famous poem by Rudyard Kipling, a British poet of the period who grew up in British India and wrote a lot of adventure stories about life out sort of in the empire. And I read some of his stories as a kid. He's a good writer. They're, at least for a kid, they're intoxicating stories. I didn't know his politics until I was older, and I didn't read this poem until I was older, studying history. But this is a poem a short one called The White Man's Burden. And you can see the arrogance of the Europeans, the racism here, the ethnocentrism, Eurocentrism in this. He says, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child." He's actually calling, peoples outside of Europe half devil and half child, right? So he's new-caught sullen peoples. It's definitely not thinking of such people as equals. But what's the burden that he's talking about? What's the burden? And what is a burden? A burden, right, is a cross to bear. A burden is sort of a weight on our shoulders, something that we are supposed to do, we have to do, that we don't really want to do. So what's the burden that Europeans have that they don't want to do, that they have to? What Kipling is saying, again, extremely ethnocentric, Eurocentric here, is that, well, we have to help the other peoples of the world. We don't really want to, because we want to go out and play and enjoy ourselves and do things for ourselves. But as Europeans and God-fearing Christians, right, and people that have superior skills and abilities, we have an obligation, a duty, a burden to go out and help those other, less able people of the world. And so he is really laying it on thick there. He wrote this poem, by the way, in support of the United States conquest and turning of the Philippines into a colonial possession, which it did. The Philippines is a colony of the United States for 40-plus years. And Theodore Roosevelt, American leader at the time, said of this poem, when he realized who had written it, and it was dedicated to the Americans, he said in a letter to one of his political allies and friends, "It's bad poetry, but a great idea." So Roosevelt approved of the idea, but thought this is lousy poetry. Actual motives for imperialism, the real reasons that they went, again, social Darwinist ideas of just blind power were sometimes used. So some Europeans would say to their colleagues and to their public, their voters, and to even people in the countries they're taking control of, and establishing empire, we're doing this because we can, because we have the power, and you can't stop us. But more often than not, there were sort of other reasons, and we've seen there's all kinds of other justifications. Historians tend to downplay the economic factors behind imperialism, but I think they're at the top of the list still. So I'm kind of among the minority that thinks that. But all of these are definitely on our screen here motives for imperialism. But the economic motives include resources. Whether you control part of the world, a country, a kingdom, formally or informally, you can take its resources. Cecil Rhodes, having access to the diamonds of South Africa, is a prime example. Right? He's a British citizen, and only because the British established imperial control and they had the power and force to back it up was he able to get the rights to and access to the diamonds, take them out of South Africa and bring them back to Europe and make himself fabulously rich in the process. The Rhodes Scholarship was a donation that he made from the money that he made or stole, one could say, from South Africa. If you control another people in an empire, formally, informally to some degree as well, you can force markets on them. So you can force your products to be bought there. In India, British India, we see a good example of this. I don't mean good in a moral sense. The Indian people, Indian society, economy, before the British arrived to establish an empire, already had long had the most vibrant and sophisticated textile industry, making of cloth and clothing in the world. Cotton fabrics and textiles were wanted and in demand worldwide, coming from India. And when the British went through their Industrial Revolution, and we know textiles were the first industry to go through that revolution, they recognized this is a problem because we'll be competing with Indian textiles, and it might not be so easy to do. So the British used their political power in India as they're establishing more and more a colonial presence and dominance in India to dismantle through legal means and otherwise the Indian textile industry. And they did. And so after a certain amount of time, by the time period we're talking about for sure, India has no textile industry. People sometimes spin their own cloth at home, but they don't sort of do it in a business. A little bit, but it's basically gone because the British have put it out of business intentionally, so it wouldn't compete. And so what do people in India do if they're not home spun? They're having to import clothing and blankets from Great Britain, halfway around the world, instead of getting it next door, or they had in the previous century and before. So this is another example of economic motives for empire. You can force other people to work for you, especially with formal control, even to the point of slave labor, which we'll see. You can have all kinds of opportunities for investments. The more colonies, the more colonial presence, imperial presence you have over the world. So I do find it strange that historians they don't deny, but tend to downplay economic motives, because if you go back before even our time period in this class and look at the beginnings of Europeans going to, say, the New World, why were they going? Well, partly to try to convert Native Americans to Christianity, but the main reason was for trade and for resources and for profit. So the question has come up, it continues to come up among scholars. Was imperialism profitable? Well, it depends on sort of who we're talking about. There's no doubt it was profitable for capitalists like Cecil Rhodes. I mean, not all capitalists. There's competition. Some businesses fail at this, but some of them succeeded spectacularly, and it did bring in quite a bit of money and resources for countries. We talked earlier about how the commercial revolution helped to fund the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain and in Europe as a whole, European continent as a whole. So it's true. But the part of this that sometimes I think gets left out is the fact that even at the height of imperial power and control, Europe, each European country was doing far more trade activity and business with other European countries than it was sort of forcing its products on the people of India or wherever else it was. So it was profitable, but it's often believed, especially right now, that Europe became wealthy simply because it used its military power to force everybody else to sort of hand over all their stuff, outside of Europe. there is some truth in that. I'm not denying it, but that's certainly not the only reason. And if you look at the trade between European countries, you can see a gigantic engine of economic growth just in that alone. Empire, added to that substantially, admittedly. Another motive for empire is power politics, European rivalries. So that is to say that Africa is a good example. The scramble for Africa. Yes, there's economic motives there too. That's why I started with economics. But part of this is economic or a political rivalry. So if the British lay down a colony, and swallow up a huge part of Africa, and then the French swallow up another part, the other European countries start to get nervous. And if we don't get a colony somewhere there, one or two European countries are going to swallow up the whole continent of Africa or South America or wherever it is, and we'll be left out, and we'll be left behind economically, politically, militarily, and otherwise. We can't afford to. We can't allow them to take the whole thing. So even if we don't really want the territory, we have to take it if for no other reason, and there are other reasons, but if for no other reason than to keep country Y from taking it first. One now long deceased British historian said the British Empire was created in a fit of absent-mindedness. Meaning the British kind of stumbled into colonies and empire, didn't really want it before they knew it. We got control of this. Damn, we have to rule it now. Kind of this idea of a burden, which certainly isn't true. But what is true is once in a while, empire was reluctant. Not most of the time, but in some cases, it was. There were situations where the British or the French, the Germans, didn't want to sort of go into something, and they did. A good example of the type of political competition that we see driving these kind of land grabs in other parts of the world, but often based on European rivalry and competition, is the showdown at Fashoda between the British and the French. We'll also look at the Egyptian trap, which is a good example of those small number of cases, but cases nonetheless, where empire was done reluctantly. Ideological reasons, social Darwinism we talked about already, is we're going to do it because we're better and because we can. Christianity, right? We're spreading Christianity. So that was seen as a legitimate motive by many Europeans. The white man's burden idea. There also was a strong strain of belief among elites in Europe and the United States. Theodore Roosevelt was a supporter of this idea, wrote about it quite a bit, that imperialism and wars, that were required to establish a formal empire, like the U.S. war against the Philippines to take it and annex it, make it a colony, were good for sort of bolstering the manhood of United States or Britain or whatever country it was. And keep in mind, this is at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, during and after the Industrial Revolution is already underway. These countries are becoming wealthy and powerful. There's women's movements in the Western European countries and the United States. And you can see kind of men shuffling and being uncomfortable, leaders especially, saying, we've become, because of our comforts now, because we're a rich country, we've become kind of too lazy. We're sitting on the couch sort of eating potato chips and watching TV, getting flabby, and we're not tough enough. We're going to lose our edge in the world. To boot, the sexism typical of the times, not that it doesn't still exist today, but that if this was the idea that was sort of being peddled and believed by guys like Roosevelt. I don't know how widespread it was, but it wasn't just him. That if, say, a guy whose wife is part of the women's movement, campaign for women's suffrage in the United States or Britain, if he goes and signs up for the military and goes off to fight some foreign war, to create an empire or a new colony, maybe that'll toughen him up some. When he comes back, he'll be sort of tough and sort of rule his household again, and sort of, instead of being kicked around by his wife, the feminist. So this is certainly a misogynistic kind of macho male attitude about one of the supposed benefits of empire. Believe it or not, that was actually real. So a fit of absent-mindedness, was it really true? Well, again, only in a certain sense and only once in a while. Neil Ferguson, in his book Empire, already alluded to, said, as leader of the opposition in Britain at one point, not always, Gladstone, we'll get to him later, had objected violently to Disraeli's, we talked about him, we will again, foreign policy in the Near East. But there were now full-scale anti-European riots in Alexandria city in Egypt. Gladstone agreed to shell Alexandria forts and invade with 1,000 troops, winning quickly at a place called Tel El Kebir and occupying Cairo the next day. But no sooner had they occupied Egypt than the British began reassuring the other powers that their presence there was only a temporary expedient. A reassurance repeated no fewer than 66 times between 1882 and 1922. In a sense, Egypt was sort of like a Vietnam situation for the British. They got in, kept saying we're going to clean this up quickly, win, and get out, and they kept getting in deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. The Egyptian trap. A good example then of a colony that they didn't really want to take. But keep in mind, in Egypt, they already really had informal control over Egypt and then took formal control in the 1880s. And that's what's being alluded to here in this quote. Why did they have informal control? Or how did they have it? There was a lot of banks that lent money to the Egyptian government. Not just British banks, but French as well. Also, the French had built the Suez Canal through Egypt, but the British by this time owned the majority of shares and controlled the company. And this became of strategic importance, sort of, more than anything else, right? Because the Suez Canal allowed ships going from Great Britain or Europe to go to Asia, instead of going all the way around the tip of Africa and then into the Indian Ocean, possibly beyond, if you're going to China, Japan, you cut through the Mediterranean Sea, go through the man-made Suez Canal, and then the Red Sea, and you're already on the other side of Africa. So it's cutting the time and distance by, I don't know, at least half. So it's of enormous economic and strategic value and benefit. So from that point forward, the British, the French, the Europeans have a vested interest in the politics, the stability of Egypt, how Egypt is going to behave. They better, maintain, allow access for us for the Suez Canal, and they better maintain at least law and order and stability in their country, because we loan a lot of money, and we can't risk losing control of the Suez Canal. So informal control of Egypt was already there. Then they get drawn in because there were anti-European riots, etc., etc., and end up being there for a long, long time. You see in the quote, and keep saying we're going to get out, tomorrow, and never do, and eventually take it in as a formal colony. So it was the move from informal to formal that was really reluctant. They'd already sort of been there informally, not so reluctantly. But here's how empires can spread in a way not necessarily wanted. And this happened in a few other places too, but this is the prime example. After Great Britain had sort of taken control of Egypt, there was ongoing opposition and violent opposition, and a number of Muslim forces staged raids on British-controlled Egypt from the Sudan, which is now the country to the south of Egypt. And so Britain eventually saw an interest in taking control informally and then formally of the Sudan in order to stop there being a platform, a staging ground for operations and raids into India. So it's actually, in this case, I think really true. They didn't want to take the Sudan formally, or even informally in that case, but they felt they have no choice, but we have to protect our interests, our strategic and economic interests in Egypt, and they're under threat from the Sudan, so we're going to go in and swallow up the Sudan as well. Not that it was pretty nice, it wasn't, but it is, I think, an example of reluctance. Technology, of course, had a lot to do with the ability of Europeans to go in to get what they wanted and carve out empires all over the world. I mean, it had everything to do with it. Steel-hulled ships, maxim guns, which meant that was the high-tech machine gun for the day. To give us just two examples of the weapon superiority by this time that the Europeans had over most of the rest of the world, the British had a ship called the Nemesis, an iron-hulled ship that was not common at all in the world at the time, that it sent to the first Opium War in the 1830s, early 1840s, not 1940s, and it just blew wooden Chinese ships out of the water one after the other. By itself, just did enormous damage because its iron hull, everything sort of bounced off of it. So this is a good symbol, the ship, the Nemesis, of European technological, in this case military technological superiority. The Battle of Omdurman, which you see on the right, was a complete blowout of a battle. This was partly in revenge, British revenge for a British general who was killed in Khartoum, Sudan. Again, a dangerous place for the British to be because, as I said, it was a staging ground for Muslim raids on Egypt. And a British force there got overrun, and a British hero, we'll see in a later slide, a general got killed. And this force, in 1894, sent out under the famous Lord Kitchener, engaged Muslim African forces at Omdurman in 1894, and the results: 23,000 killed on the Muslim African side, and 430 British soldiers killed. This was a case almost literally of machine guns against spears. One could say it was a massacre more than it was a battle. Winston Churchill, in the military, kind of more of a military reporter or journalist, but was there as a young man, said, "Out on the plain on the other side, bullets were shearing through flesh, smashing and splintering bone, valiant men struggling through a hell of whistling metal and exploding shells." The Battle of Omdurman as one single battle, and the Nemesis as one single ship, are good examples, though there are many, many others, of the technological superiority, mostly shipbuilding, maritime superiority, and gunpowder technology superiority. Another important feature and element of the success of European empire, their being able to establish imperial bases in the first place, foundations, or explorers. These were usually kind of freelance, almost like capitalists that were sent out, who did some of the advanced legwork, and they became famous not just sort of trying to carve out the beginnings of an empire in Africa and other places, but they also discovered things as well. Not that Africans and peoples in other parts of the world hadn't discovered them themselves, but Europeans didn't know about some of these places in Africa and other parts of the world until their explorers discovered them. Henry Morton Stanley was actually born in the United States, but worked for the British and other governments. David Livingstone, another one of there are a number of famous explorers, but part of what they did was sort of make treaties as they were exploring, and sort of saying, okay, what's in this continent? What kind of resources are here? I got to report back to the British government so they can know whether it's worth their while to come in here and use force to take control, so they can strip the resources. But they were supposed to make treaties sometimes, and did, with local chieftains to sort of start the process of European insinuation there. Livingstone, on the right, had believed in the power of the gospel, says Neil Ferguson. Stanley believed only in brute force. Livingstone had been appalled by slavery. Stanley would connive at its restoration. Above all, Livingstone had been indifferent to political frontiers. Stanley wanted to see Africa carved up, as it was. And so it was. By 1878, Stanley was working on behalf of King Leopold II, Belgium, to create a private colony for his African Association in the Congo. By an irony that would have appalled Livingstone, the Belgian Congo would soon become notorious for its murderous system of slave labor. And in maybe the most single famous incident in all of European empire with regard to explorers and adventurers, Livingstone, working for the British government, had kind of disappeared, gone off the grid. And they weren't sure if he was dead or alive, and they sent Stanley out to try to find him, and amazingly, he found him. And the moment when they, it's depicted in the drawing on the right, when they came into contact, Stanley said, supposedly, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" And he apparently said, "Yes, here I am." And the news was eventually reported back, okay, Livingstone's still around. I forget how and why he got off the grid, sort of outside the radar, but he had. In the middle of the 1880s, the Europeans tried to organize the scramble for Africa a little more to make it less of a scramble, and Bismarck and the leader of France, Jules Ferry, hosted a conference in Berlin, which made Bismarck the main host. As Neil Ferguson says, the real purpose of the conference was to define the conditions under which future territorial annexations in Africa might be recognized. Here was a true thieves' compact, a charter for the partition of Africa, based on nothing more legitimate than their effective occupation, and the division of the spoils began at once. So, either way, both before, when it was more of a competitive scramble between the Europeans, or after the conference, where they kind of agreed to carve up Africa, Africa did fall into the hands, mostly in formal acquisitions, formal annexations to European powers. But this did limit some of the conflict and potential conflict between the European countries over, colonial territory. The Fashoda incident I mentioned before as a good example of this kind of competitive concern about, well, we got to get there before they do. We have to get a colony in that part of the world first, and we can't allow them to get too much. At a place called Fashoda in Northeast Africa, in a comical sounding scene, as part of the scramble for Africa, a small British and French force kind of ran into each other, not knowing that the other were doing the same thing. Both of them spotted, before they ever left, their government sent them out, because they spotted a place on the map that hadn't been claimed yet by, one of the European powers. And so a British group, adventurers, soldiers, showed up, and a French group at the same time. So we're here first. We claimed it. No, we claimed it. And so it's this kind of Keystone Cops type situation. As Gordon Craig says, the British encountered a small French Sudanese force under Colonel Jean-Baptiste Marchand, nice French name, which had made an extraordinary 3,000-mile journey through trackless jungles, endless deserts, and brackish swamps to plant the French tricolor at Fashoda. Such were imperial emotions that for several months it appeared as if the Fashoda affair would actually bring war between Britain and France. This is a pretty small number of troops and guys on one side and the other over a pretty small piece of territory, and it almost caused an outright full-on war between Britain and France. This is as late as 1898, after the Berlin Conference. So it's certainly, that conference certainly didn't make everything kosher between the European powers. The British Empire at its height, we can see all the areas in pink that the British had control of around the turn of the 20th century. And the Leviathan argument. This is to say that since the British Empire was large, and the British did have the capacity through the success of their political system, capitalist system, legal system, to rule large areas, India, Australia, etc., the argument is made by some scholars today, like Neil Ferguson, but there are others as well, that bigger governments tend to be more effective governments, that they tend to reduce violence through policing, internal violence like murder. They tend to be able to fend off foreign attackers, so defense, and they tend to create bigger and more successful economies that raise standards of living. So if that's true in a general sense, then it might also be true, and this is what some scholars believe, of colonies. That if in fact the English or whatever European country we're talking about went in and centralized power in a place where it had never been centralized before and create sort of strong government and kind of market there. It ends up benefiting politically, legally, and economically even the indigenous people, the people whose home that is. Again, this gets back to the dicey argument about can we or can we not in any way justify European empire. Again, I told you I play devil's advocate here. This is the argument made. You think of it what you please. Gladstone versus Disraeli. This is one of the great rivalries in political history, not just in Britain, but really globally, at least in the 19th century. William Ewart Gladstone was an off and on liberal prime minister of Great Britain, and Benjamin Disraeli, his arch political opponent and foe, was the off and on British prime minister on the conservative side of the aisle in the House of Commons. I say off and on because they traded the prime ministership back and forth a number of times. So they were the respective leaders of the liberal and conservative parties of their era. So the leading figures in British politics in the time period we're talking about right now. And I think they're a good example. They didn't like each other particularly much. They're a good example, however, of how political rivalry can be healthy. It can be really unhealthy as well. In our society today, I would argue ours doesn't look quite as healthy. But these guys kind of pushed each other to kind of greater and greater efforts. And the blend of ideas, right, and the competition over ideas, I think helped the citizens of Britain and really Europe as a whole to have sort of a better understanding of the world they lived in and a sort of a better menu of options. So this is a classic, famous political rivalry between two incredibly gifted politicians, two of the greatest prime ministers by everybody's acclaim in all of British history, and they disagreed on everything, especially on empire. Gladstone and the liberals in general by the late 19th century, if not before, thought empire was nothing to be proud of. Gladstone wasn't saying we should give all the colonies back, but he is saying, was saying we shouldn't take more territory, we shouldn't be so aggressive, and we should think about over the long haul, trying to scale back and at least gradually find sort of alternatives. Disraeli, leading the Conservative Party, thought no such thing. And believed that empire was a legitimate source of pride, and that empire did good, not just for the British, but for the other peoples of the world. Gladstone saying, not at the same time as the other guy, but here's my first principle of foreign policy: good government at home. So Gladstone, though he certainly was involved in foreign policy, and was as gifted at that as he was at domestic policy, he was more interested in domestic policy. On the other side, the conservative Disraeli said colonies do not cease to be colonies because they are independent, which is in a sense talking about the importance of informal empire. Gladstone said at one point, men are apt to mistake the strength of their feeling for the strength of their argument. The heated mind resents the chill touch of relentless scrutiny of logic. The chill touch and relentless scrutiny of logic. Saying people often think that their passion is the same as a strong argument. So I put when leaders had political wisdom, implying of course that they don't anymore. But that's sort of open for debate. And Disraeli, who was known for his wit, Gladstone wasn't. Gladstone was a very serious, kind of pious politician. At least he sort of lectured everybody about morality constantly. A very high-minded politician, a brilliant orator, speaker, as was Disraeli in a different way. Disraeli was funny and personable and so witty that you didn't really want to engage with him on the floor of the House of Commons because he was, not only witty but quick-witted. And so he's known for a lot of funny lines and some quotes that are funny that are still around. I like this one particularly, as pithy as it is. William Gladstone has not a single redeeming defect. So when political insults were still clever, That doesn't seem to be true at all any longer. But so when the Liberals under Gladstone were in power, held the majority in the House of Commons, had Gladstone as the Prime Minister, empire tended to be scaled back, or at least not as aggressive. When Disraeli replaced him, again back and forth, the Conservatives were in power. The approach to British colonies became a bit more assertive and aggressive again. So the back and forth of British politics did have a lot to do with other peoples of the world and what they felt in terms of the weight of the British Empire on them, pressed against them. To show us some of the kind of gory details, the ugly side, there are many of them. I just picked out a few of European imperialism, which certainly argues right against any idea that this was beneficial for the peoples outside of Europe that were being colonized and having empire forced on them. The First Opium War is a good example, and the resulting Treaty of Nanjing in 1842. The British forced the Manchu dynasty to reopen the opium trade that the British were trafficking in. The British, it says at the top, were, you could say, were legal drug dealers, and hard drug dealers at that, because opium is what? Comes from poppies. It's basically heroin. And the British were making a ton of money by growing poppies in mostly India and selling them in China. And they'd created, hundreds of thousands, maybe a million or more drug addicts, basically heroin addicts in China. And the Chinese emperor had the strange idea that, one, it was his country, and two, that he had some responsibility to stop such serious drug addiction in his own country. He had an official and agents go out and seize British chests of British opium and dump them into the harbor, into the river. And they did. And that led the British, you'd think, say, okay, well, you know what? They have a point. This isn't good for anybody. We're drug dealers here. We're making a lot of money off it, yes, but it's immoral. We're Christians. It's wrong. Okay, we'll stop. We know that's not what they did. They sent out troops. They sent out ships, including the Nemesis, which we've already seen, and through a war, the First Opium War, which means there was a second one too, which they won. They forced, in this treaty and the others that followed, the Chinese into not only accepting the ongoing, continuing dealing, selling of opium in their own country, right under their nose, against their will, but more of it, and opening more Chinese ports to trade in opium and other products as well. Nasty, to put it mildly. We do see here in the anti-imperialist movement in India, I just picked out this as an example, there are others, but of an ongoing opposition to European, in this case British Empire, that in the end was successful. This is famous partly because the most famous of the leaders was Mohandas, or the Mahatma Gandhi. He became known, the spiritual and political leader of Indian independence. Again, not the only leader and not singly the most powerful, certainly the most revered and the most well-known, and the guy that kind of had the most clout, but he wasn't necessarily imposing himself as the sole leader. Nehru and others were big parts of this. The Indian National Congress, which was formed in 1885, you see a first meeting of, photograph of in the upper left. So they formed their own Congress, representatives from different parts of the country getting together, and the main goal was to start forming strategies and engaging in activities, planning activity that would end in the establishment of an independent India and ousting the British from there. There was before that, in 1857, a mutiny of Indian troops who were serving under British in British military. The British had small numbers of soldiers in India, a huge country, so they paid Indian soldiers to do their bidding for them at times. But in 1857, a number of them rose up, which led to an uprising of not just soldiers, but of many of the people of India against British rule. It was put down at great loss of life on both sides, but it shows that empire is going to be met with pushback, whether it's successful or not, or successful at first or not. It depends. In the lower left, you see a depiction of a gruesome event that took place into the 20th century in 1919, when a British general named Dwyer ordered his troops, most of them, again, Indians themselves, into a public square that was walled in, where there was a public meeting taking place, and opened fire on them, and they were locked in, killing hundreds and hundreds of them. The British had posted a notice because there'd been quite a bit of political resistance activity against Britain. This was in the Punjab, by the way, and so the notice put up there was no public meetings, no public gatherings, until we say otherwise. So this was official British policy, and so Dwyer thought, I need to make sure that they understand that we're not joking around. So they're violating the order. So I'm going to fire on them. But this was a peaceful group. They weren't even involved in a political protest. There had been some, but this wasn't one. But since the order said no public meetings of any kind, Dwyer thought, I'm doing the right thing, which, of course, is appalling. And even some of his own officers apparently thought, shouldn't we give them a warning first and sort of get them, just ask them to, leave or tell them to leave? And he apparently said that they've already had their warning and opened fire on them, and most of them were stuck, so it ended up killing hundreds. The British, to their credit, did basically forced this guy, General Dyer, from his position. They held a series of inquiries, brought in witnesses, brought him in to testify. The British government did the British military or the British government had not authorized this. He kind of acted on his own, so it wasn't on their authority. And they did, they didn't put him in prison, but they did relieve him of command and hold hearings and sort of, get to the bottom of it and say that kind of stuff can't happen. But Gandhi, the Indian leader, said about this incident, he actually visited the blood-stained place afterwards in great sadness, but said in a meeting with the British after the fact, he goes, you don't understand. It doesn't matter that you guys didn't order Dyer to do this, because when one country has as much power over another as you guys do in a colonial in a colony type situation, these kind of things happen regardless of whether it's supposed to or not. So he had a point. He had a legitimate, definite point on this. Chinese Gordon, we've already talked about, at least indirectly. He was the guy who was sent to Khartoum in Sudan to try to put down the Muslim forces that were using it as the sort of the foundation to raid Egypt, and he got surrounded in Khartoum, and his garrison of British troops got overwhelmed, and all of them killed, including him. It's what led the Gladstone government to send out Lord Kitchener's column, military force that massacred Muslim troops at Omdurman in Africa after the fact. All of this stuff was so controversial in Great Britain that it almost brought the Gladstone government down, meaning forced him out of power. And he did get forced out of power at times, so I already told you he and Disraeli traded the prime ministership back and forth. But this is a good example of how colonial politics, colonial events could really affect and roil the politics at home in London and Great Britain itself. The Boer War, an example of how confusing and complicated colonialism and imperialism could be. This was a war primarily of the British against colonists in South Africa of Dutch origin. The Afrikaners, as they became known, had been a group of settlers in South Africa decades and decades before, and their descendants are now still there. They'd been at the British's throats back and forth for a time. They had their own colony for a time, but the British ended up overrunning it. But the Boers, again, descendants of the Dutch, they still spoke Dutch, were fiercely independent and partially over control of resources, gold and silver, gold and diamonds. They ended up going to war, and this also became kind of a Vietnam kind of quagmire type situation. Quagmire is like a like quicksand, and this phrase or this term quagmire was used in Vietnam. So the Americans sort of sinking deeper and deeper into the quagmire, into the quicksand. This war, the British did win, but after 3 bloody years and fighting oftentimes against an enemy employing guerrilla tactics, which is extremely difficult to fight against, and the Boers were really good at it. And so this also polarized public opinion at home because a growing number of British citizens, particularly in those that supported the Liberals in Parliament, thought, why are we doing this? What's the point of having a colony in South Africa anyway? If it's going to lead to a war, excuse me, especially with fellow Europeans, why are we even there? Professor Perry, our guy, says everything about the Boer War was unfortunate for the British. The Boers were formidable opponents. Hatred for the British in the European press was almost universal. The war was exceptionally costly in both money and lives. So they won it, but at a huge cost. So they got bashed in the European press, who loved this opportunity to make the British look bad. That's partially true because the British thought of themselves as kind of the more lenient imperialists, the nicer imperialists, which actually was somewhat true, although a relative argument doesn't necessarily mean that much. Relative to someone that's, unbelievably cruel, someone that's just cruel is less cruel, but that doesn't tell us very much. Nonetheless, this is part of the reason that the other European countries, journalists and newspapers loved the opportunity to pile on the British here. So this is a disaster really for the British, even though they won the war. Possibly the most egregious example of European empire during this period comes from the King of Belgium, Leopold II, who you see pictured here. If you're interested, there's a phenomenal book written by a Berkeley literature professor, or I think journalism professor, named Adam Hochschild, called King Leopold's Ghost, written about 15, 20 years ago. But it tells this story sort of in gruesome detail, but very eloquently. So Leopold was the King of Belgium, and he grew up a rich kid, a prince, son of a king and queen, and was a smart guy, but was apparently really greedy. He studied economics in school. It's a king is already like kind of rich, even if it's little old Belgium. And it says here on the top, this is certainly a paraphrase, but his sort of attitude seems to have been, as king, once he became king, like, I'm too important to be the king of little old Belgium. Why wasn't I born the Emperor of Germany or the King of England? Why did I get Belgium? I'm too big for that. And so he embarked on his own kind of colonial conquest and colonial expansion. And eventually his country, Belgium, its government, its parliament, got behind the colonial empire. But at first, it's actually fair to say that King Leopold II was the only European individual that kind of carved out his own colony in another part of the world. Because he used his own kind of personal money. At first, the Belgian parliament wasn't really interested. And so this was a constitutional monarchy that by this time was leaning more on the side of constitutional than monarchy. So he had to kind of go this alone if he wanted to do it, but he did. He just used his own, family, basically money, to pay adventurers and explorers like Henry Morton Stanley to go out. And he went to a part of Africa that hadn't been, totally controlled yet by other countries, known as the Congo, kind of in like the center of sub-Saharan Africa. And this guy used his sort of greed and, ambition to carve out this empire for himself, and then eventually Belgium, at huge cost to people, the African peoples of those areas. incredibly greedy. He never set foot in Africa, never, and yet took an enormous amount of money and treasure out of it. At first, it was ivory that was the commodity that sold for huge prices on worldwide markets, and then eventually it was rubber. As the Industrial Revolution continued to pace, rubber became an increasingly important commodity in modern industry and modern economies. So on two separate products, he made a gold mine. Many of the palaces and riches in Brussels today, capital of Belgium, were probably financed by this stripping of colonies through greed and utter cruelty that you'll never hear if you go on a tour of any of those palaces. Of course, you wouldn't hear that. But to give us a sense of the cruelty, and you can see it from the upper right picture, which I apologize for, but I do believe it's important to show us the horrors that are often, sadly, tragically a part of history. But we're not positive that this was Leopold's idea or even his policy, but it has his MO on it, I think. So it's most likely that it was, and Adam Hochschild in the book I mentioned thinks so as well. But he had soldiers that had to kind of police the Congo because as he was stripping resources, surprise, surprise, there were from time to time rebellions of African villagers that were not wild about the Belgian presence there, and so they'd rise up in a violent rebellion. So he had to have a military force on the ground. But it appears that he became worried about, as cheap as he was, too much expenditure. And so he wanted to keep track of ammunition. So when he sent a group of, 50 soldiers out to an African village in reprisal for a rebellion, he had their commanding officer or the guy in charge of supply keep track of how much ammunition went out and how much came back. What he wanted to get to, it appears, was as close to a 1-to-1 ratio between bullets expended and dead people on the other side as possible. So how did they prove how many they killed? Well, you can see from the terrible picture there, they would cut off hands and arms. And sometimes, apparently, as you see, of people that are still alive, so they can say, well, we killed all these people because they didn't want to get in trouble for missing with bullets. But sometimes the hands and arms brought back in baskets were actually from corpses that had been killed by bullets coming to rifles. But the idea was, okay, you guys, you have 15 hands in the barrel, and let's see, I'm counting here, there were 29 bullets expended. Well, that's better than last time. You guys are improving. So cheapness, miserliness on the part of one could say a murderous king. And he had a railroad built through incredibly difficult mountainous territory. Thousands of Africans died doing this. And some of this ended up being slave labor. To tap the rubber vines, of course, Belgians wouldn't do it. Leopold wouldn't do it. He wasn't even there. He'd send his troops out, again, maybe a small force to an African village, and at gunpoint round up the women and children and take them away and put them in, under lock and key somewhere back at their home base, and then tell the men of the village, okay, here's the quota of rubber that we need. We need this many buckets in a week, and so we'll come back in a week. And if you have the buckets of rubber full, hand them over to us. We'll give your women and children back. They kidnapped the women and children from an African village and wouldn't give them back unless and until they got their quota and supply of rubber. Going to send them out to tap rubber vines and come back and collect the raw rubber, which of course they usually did because they wanted to see their women and children again. So this is slave labor. This is murder and slave labor and inhumanity beyond belief. Maybe worse is in the German colony of Southwest Africa, a German general named Lothar von Trotha, not famous except for this. but he committed what some have called a genocide or attempted genocide there, tried to seemingly wipe out the entire Herero tribe of South Africa. Evans, in pursuit of power, and you can see some of those that weren't killed ended up being deprived of food and other important resources intentionally under conditions of immense viciousness. Some 14,000 troops were dispatched from Berlin under von Trotha. I know, he said, that African tribes yield only to violence. To exercise this violence with crass terrorism and even gruesomeness was and is my policy. Herero men were shot, while women and children were driven into the desert and left to starve. And you can see the results of the latter on the right. In fairness to the Germans, not that I need to be fair to the Germans, but the German governor of German Southwest Africa quit over this. He was supposed to be the boss of General von Trotha, and he was appalled and was opposed to it, and was probably shocked when the government at home from Berlin sided with von Trotha, and said we're gonna let him do that. And the governor, wait a minute, I'm the governor, and I don't want him to do it. I'm opposed to it. Well, then you can come home. And so the guy quit because he was, again, thought this was just a moral obscenity. We'd call today a crime against humanity, as it certainly was. So these are certainly the lowest points of late 19th century imperialism, but nonetheless, we've painted an overall picture that, as I said at the beginning, it does make it hard, I think, for Neil Ferguson's and other professors in the minority. Majority of professors think otherwise, but those who still try to claim that European imperialism benefited peoples in other parts of the world that they conquered and took forced under imperialist control. Once we've gone through one horror story after another, it becomes increasingly harder and harder to make that argument.